Happy New Year, everyone. I'm Linda Ayers. Welcome to Tuesday Talks DC, brought to you by the Cleveland and Woodley Park Village, Cleveland Park Main Street, Woodley Park Main Street, and the DC Public Library. Please join in the conversation tonight by posting your comments and questions at any time during tonight's presentation using the chat screen on your computer. Tonight's talk is Listening to Ghosts, Conjuring Characters, Drawing from Life and Creating Fiction. Ellen Prentice Campbell's most recent novel, Frida's Song, was inspired by the life of the renowned psychotherapist Frida from Reichmann, who fled Nazi Germany in 1935 and practiced at the Chestnut Lodge in Rockville, Maryland, until her death in 1957. It's also inspired by the fire that destroyed that lodge in 2009. Tonight, Ellen will be in conversation with writer Virginia Hartman, and they'll discuss the use of history, experience, and imagination in fiction. Ellen's debut novel, The Bowl with Gold Seams, received the National Indie Excellence Award for historical fiction, and her book, Contents Under Pressure, was nominated for the National Book Award. She writes for the Washington Independent Review of Books and the Fiction Writers Review. She lives in Cleveland Park. Virginia Hartman has a new novel coming out, her first, in just a few months, May 2022. So congratulations to Ginny. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared widely, from the Hudson Review to the Alaska Quarterly Review, the Washingtonian, the Potomac Review, and many others. And her work has been anthologized in Gravity Dancers, Even More Fiction by Washington Area Women. Ginny teaches creative writing at George Washington University and at the Writers Center in Bethesda, where she and Ellen met. Tonight, I'd like to welcome Ellen Prentice Campbell and Virginia Hartman.
Thank you so much, Linda. I feel very honored to be talking with my friend Ellen tonight. She's a wonderful writer, and I'm kind of in awe of all of her accomplishments. And I noticed, Ellen, that the Bowl with Gold Seams won the Indie Excellence Award for Historical Fiction, and here you are again in Frida's Song, dealing with history. And it seems like you have a very important creative connection to history. And I'd like to talk about that spark at length, but why don't we start with the history of Chestnut Lodge? What first let you know there was an important story there?
Well, you know, it's a Rockville institution, even though it no longer exists. And I grew up in Rockville, not near the lodge. But when I moved back to Rockville, my husband and our kids settled just a couple of blocks from the Chestnut Lodge Psychiatric Hospital in Old Rockville. I was a social worker. I was practicing psychotherapy at a community agency. The Chestnut Lodge Psychiatric Hospital at that point in time, this would have been the mid-1980s, was still in operation. It was still providing long-term residential care as well as other services. And an important thing that the lodge did for the community of mental health professionals was they invited and included us in a once-a-year symposium, which was a chance to hear remarkable speakers talk both about the present day at the lodge and its history. I love old buildings, and the lodge and the old houses surrounding it in Rockville were very, very, very resonant for me, even before I was writing, because I wasn't writing fiction at this point. I was just working full-time as a social worker and raising my kids. But there's no question but what living in Old Rockville, being close to many of these old buildings, being involved with the Rockville Historic Society, Peerless Rockville, which ultimately would save Frida's Cottage, all contributed to the book idea that ultimately became Frida's Song. Even Ginny, you know, when you live in an old house, people come and knock on your door. And we lived in an old house, and not infrequently, people would come knock at the door and say, I used to live here. Would you mind if I came in and looked around? And you know, I'm a house junkie, and I'm incredibly connected to places I used to live. So I would never, ever say no. And I learned so much from those folks who came and visited, usually just once. And one of my visitors, I think, again, really was very much part of what ultimately inspired me to write Frida's song. We only met that once, but we've become pen pals of a sort. And she came and she told me that she and her two sisters and her mom had come to live in that house in the early 1950s, relocating from New York State because her dad was a long-term patient at Chestnut Lodge. And like many families in that era, they wanted to be close to him while he was in treatment. So I think both my professional work and hearing about Frida Fromm-Reichmann through my professional work and living in the heart of Rockville, it was just like they all conspired to draw me to this story.
If you had to name one aspect of Frida Fromm-Reichmann that intrigued you the most, what would it be?
I think probably what would intrigue me the most, and what in a sense just really amazes me, astonishes me, is to think of Frida Fromm-Reichmann coming to this country in 1935 as a refugee, a German Jewish refugee, giving up everything, her family, her friends, her colleagues, the hospital that she had founded and was running, coming to this country and reestablishing herself, practicing psychoanalysis. She was a psychiatrist, practicing psychoanalysis in a language that was not her first language, practicing when she was afflicted with a progressive congenital deafness. So I think one of the things that intrigued me was this was a woman who overcame so many obstacles and contributed so much. And I think that strength and that resilience really, really fascinated me and still does.
And she really was a pioneer, right? I mean, like, what do you think gave her the strength to break so many boundaries and obstacles that existed at that time?
I think tremendous determination and tremendous belief in what she was doing. I also think that, and again, and you know this as a novelist, it's dangerous territory for me to opine about what she was thinking or feeling, because over the many years I wrote this novel, with Frida and with the two fictional characters, the contemporary Eliza, who's a psychotherapist, and her 16-year-old son, Nick, as an author, over the years writing, you become so close to those characters. You feel as though you're slipping into them, don't you? You know?
Yeah.
So I speak for Frida, but it's my imagined Frida, deeply informed by research and history. But there is no doubt, but what I'm speaking from my understanding of my fictionalized Frida. But I believe that for her, practicing, helping profoundly mentally ill individuals was something that pulled her through the challenges and losses of her own life. That it was dedication to healing, but that healing was also something that the work provided to her. And that's very much a theme throughout the book. I'm really interested in the theme of healing and the way it goes back and forth in relationships, whether we're talking about therapeutic relationships or colleague relationships or friendships when we pull each other through hard times, family relationships. So I think that's, I believe that her belief and the way she benefited herself from the work of healing is what gave her some of that strength. But she was a remarkable pioneer. And one of the things that's exciting is, as simultaneously as I was writing this book, Chestnut Lodge being completely vanished due to a fire in 2009, Frida's custom-built cottage on the grounds still surviving. Frida's cottage was nominated by Peerless Rockville for a National Historic Landmark. And over the years that I was writing the book, I had the pleasure and the sort of daunting task of being part of the group of people who provided testimony and reasons for the landmark status going through. And indeed, Frida's cottage is a National Historic Landmark now. And that's such a tremendous validation for Frida as a woman of science, a refugee. It's great.
That must have been gratifying for you too, to, be a part of that, so that what was happening in real life was paralleling what you were working on in your fiction.
It was tremendous fun. And, being able to actually visit the cottage during its restoration, which was a brief visit before the fire, and then being invited back into the cottage by the woman who at the time I visited and stayed longer in the cottage, chatting with her, lived in the cottage. The cottage really is part of what inspired this book, because I really believe that houses and walls, they contain our lives, and they continue to bear the imprint, I think, of the people who've lived within them.
Well, and in the novel, that is true, because the modern day protagonist finds writings of Frida's kind of in a crawl space in the attic, and that propels the narrative, and also details a lot of Frida's history, which is lovely. It's a lovely way to depict that.
Well, it's fun. And you know this too, when you're writing something, the way you can make things happen. I needed a way for Frida to speak. I hadn't originally imagined Frida being a character in the novel, Ginny.
Oh, wow.
When you read that short story years and years ago, when we were in the writing group together, the short story had Eliza and Nick as characters. But at that point, I didn't even really imagine that Frida would be a speaking character, but she absolutely demanded in. And so then I had to find a way for her to speak to Eliza over 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so the cottage in reality has more storage space than you ever saw in a small house. And so it seemed logical, particularly since many of Frida's papers honestly had disappeared after her death, that Eliza's difficult son, Nick, would find this hidden diary, and that it would begin to be part of Frida's presence in the cottage.
And part of what starts to heal Eliza and Nick's relationship in a way as well. Yes,
Eliza is very, very lonely, and in her own way struggling both with her work as a psychotherapist and with her parenting. And she really turns to the sort of the essence of Frida that still imbues that cottage for support, for mentorship, and derives tremendous comfort from reading that diary. Now, I had to arrange for the diary to be written in English.
Right, that's true.
and so my contrivance was that Frida, when she came to this country, she already spoke English, but that she wanted to perfect her English and was particularly pressured, knowing she would be ultimately going deaf. So I had her write the diary in English because it would be a way to practice her English. And when I told a book group about this wonderful contrivance of mine, it was a book group of women who speak English as a second language, and their teacher hosts the book group. So I told them, I'd invented this reason for the diary to be in English, and they all laughed, and they said their teacher always said, the first thing you must do when you're learning a foreign language is write a diary in that language. It will help you find your voice. So I was like, oh, well.
Well, wonderful confirmation, right? Well, that was my other question when you talked about the way that Frida was not in the story to begin with. I was trying to imagine your process, and I wanted to ask you about the architecture of this novel. And so that was you've kind of answered a little bit some of that question, because I wondered if you had written all of the modern day story and then all of the Frida's story and then melded them together, or if you had done it in a different way. What was your process in terms of building
In terms of of sort of getting these three strands braided together, it was not a situation where I wrote all the way through the novel with just the original two characters, Eliza and her son Nick, although they were the only characters in the initial short story. But what happened for me as I was writing what I thought would be a story very much focused just on the end of the lodge, the fire in 2009, and very much focused on what it was like for Eliza and Nick to be living next door to the lodge. I had Eliza and Nick in conversation with each other, and I had Eliza relying on Frida's presence, which in the early drafts of the story was, she honestly would look at a photograph of Frida that was hanging in her study in the cottage, or she would return to Frida's wonderful book, which I also read many times as a social worker, Principles of Intensive Psychotherapy, and Eliza would return to that and read it. But I was working with many different versions of the story, and when I was on a writer's retreat at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, I had the really wonderful experience of Frida's voice breaking through and demanding to be part of the story. And I think that happened to me partly because I had worked through so many different versions of the novel at that point. And there was this missing piece, and I think it was Frida. So it wasn't an intentional redesign, but it was something that grew out of what was happening with Eliza's relationship with Frida and Nick's relationship with his mother and with living in the quote unquote shrink museum.
Well, I have to admit that the Frida sections are extremely vibrant, and I felt so much that I was there with her as a reader. So they really resonate. Do you think that being a psychotherapist yourself affected the way that you approach this story of two psychotherapists separated?
There's no doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jenny. There's just no doubt, you know. And again, you know, the way all of our lived experience does inform what we write. Even though, as I say, I feel like I should have a disclaimer on all my books, you know, no real animals were harmed in the making of this book. But one of the things that was such a principle of my work was listening, you know, listening to the person in my office and really attending. And so I think for me, when I'm writing in general, and particularly when I was writing this novel, which draws so deeply in part on my own professional memories, I was really thinking about that process of listening. And again, the way it goes both ways. And I think as a writer, I have found that when the writing is going well, I'm listening to my characters. I'm really listening to my characters. But I think that capacity for listening was partly something that developed over many years practicing psychotherapy.
Well, I have heard that writing fiction, and of course there are exceptions, but is an act of empathy, because you have to put yourself in the shoes of your characters, however different from you they might be. So I can see how you might bring in aspects of things that you have learned, and yet it takes on a whole new life because you didn't escape Nazi Germany, but you give us a sense of that dread that she has for her family. Was it difficult to capture that period of history when, like, the world seemed to be coming apart in Europe and there were so many evil forces kind of brewing?
For me, I love to have history as sort of a jumping off point. But I think one of the things that seems true to me is there's such a thread that runs through time, so that even though we haven't experienced what was happening at another historical moment in time, there's just such a resonance with what people go through, that as I begin to do research, and as I begin that process of really knowing my characters and weaving history into the characters' lives, it's not difficult. It's actually a wonderful process. It's hard to tease out where research and then just a sort of a deep understanding of where the story is going. It's hard to tease those apart after the fact. Mm-hmm. But I don't find it hard to imagine what it might have been like. Obviously, again, that doesn't mean I get it all. I haven't lived through it. But I think if I'm writing and if I'm really working the vein of the story, it comes through.
It's there. It's definitely there. And also you bring up the fact that though she came here for refuge, there was structural anti-Semitism here. Like, Jews were not allowed to own property in Rockville, which she's reminded of, and she is not allowed to own the cottage for that reason. So
there were many covenants and set-asides, and there were certainly parts of Montgomery County and parts of Rockville where Jews could, in 1935, 36, have owned property. She certainly couldn't have owned a cottage on the lodge grounds, and it certainly seemed to me to be true to what was necessary for her to experience, to have that be something that she was aware of. Mm-hmm. I think that it's important when we're looking back in time not to idealize other times, so that the fact that there were things that were very much wrong here, absolutely.
I thought it was interesting that, her entire focus was on kind of a new method of psychotherapy and bringing that to the lodge. And yet she resisted therapy for herself. I thought that was interesting, because in modern times that, having a therapist be in therapy is often kind of part of the package, right?
Well, I think Frida was, again, she was a product of early and remarkable days. When she was practicing and when she was teaching in Germany, many of her students then also became her colleagues. One of her students became her husband. She herself would have been analyzed as part of her training. But, later in her life, and again, remember that I'm writing about my Frida, but later in her life, in the novel, when she is, for many reasons, quite desperately alone, she feels she would be too vulnerable. She would be too vulnerable and too prey to being found out. But it's interesting looking back how different boundaries were at that time, and that's also something that I was very interested in, because I think for Eliza as a present day psychotherapist, and for Frida as a psychoanalyst in an intensive residential treatment center in the 30s and 40s, sort of the norms and expectations were very different. I mean, it's fascinating to think of a time when patients and analysts, as was the case in Rockville, would have sometimes socialized together, played tennis together, gone on vacation together. Those would be such boundary violations now. So again, the book is partly about Frida and what it was like then, but it's also just very much in general about the questions of relationships, of healing relationships, of flawed relationships, transgressive relationships. And I think those questions are as fascinating to me as the historical aspects of the work.
Sure. Would it be a spoiler to mention how she died? Was that an important element to the way you thought of her?
Well, I would say I purposely, and I guess I will avoid it as a spoiler for people who haven't read the book.
Yeah.
As one of my kids reminded me, Mom, Frida from Reichman is not exactly a household word, because there's a part of me that feels like, but everybody knows what happened to the lodge and everybody knows what happened to Frida, but I know that's not really true. So I'm actually not going to spell it out, but I will say, my intent in the book is to leave it a bit ambiguous as to how she died.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, in fact, the case. So I will say, for those of you who haven't read it, there's some ambiguity about how she died. But part of what drew me, I think, without my even realizing it, to the book and to the study of Frida that then became fictionalized in the book, was the mystery surrounding her life to some extent, the mystery surrounding her death to some extent. I mean, you're a writer. We love mysteries. We love filling in the blanks.
Well, and there's a wonderful part of the book where a Frida impersonator in the modern day comes in, and for some she is perceived as a ghost. And so that's in fitting with our theme tonight, right? She kind of has this quality throughout the book where she's an influence on Eliza, the modern day character, an influence on her son Nick, a ghost perhaps, but we're not sure. And so you bring it together in such an interesting way. You meld the past and the present so well.
Well, I love that. I love that you noticed that, and I love working with ghosts. Working with the possibility of ghosts, because part of what this book, I think, is about is that death isn't the end of the story, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's ghosts in any haunted house kind of way, but just that there's a way in which death isn't the end of the story, that people who are no longer here can still very much be informing present lives.
Sure. Now, I mentioned that your previous book was about a historical time period, and this one also. What is it about historical events that intrigues you and makes you want to construct a fictional storyline around the basic facts?
Well, it both intrigues me, and it's something that I kind of shy away from. I've written a bit recently about what I call resisting the pigeonhole, in that, neither The Bull with Gold Seams nor Frida's Song is really a traditional historical novel, in that there's a lot of melding of different time periods. But I think part of what I love about writing that is inspired by historical place and fact to begin with, no matter where it goes, is I think it gives me kind of a step back so that I can look at that moment. I can begin imagining that moment with a little bit of authorial detachment that I think is helpful. And I think also it's something I find helpful in my own life. You know, I think about this past 2 years with the pandemic, and I think it's been so useful to me to sort of remind myself and be in touch with, either because of my writing or just because of my reading or my thinking, to remember other historical times with similar or dissimilar difficulties. You know, that there's a way in which just the, you know, sort of the continuity of difficult times, all of them different, all of them unique, but the continuity of human experience of difficulties is, I think, part of what attracts me to writing, which is not just centered in present day experience or autobiographical fiction, but has this element of other times and other places.
Well, and it provides a certain rootedness as well. We know where we are, and we know when we are, and so all of the present day or near present day characters kind of have a grounding in what has come before in that same place. I just want to remind anyone who has tuned in late that we are talking with Ellen Prentice Campbell, and she is the author most recently of Frida's Song, and she has many honors for her previous novel and stories, and I did have a request to repeat your name for those who had tuned in late. Ellen, do you have tips for people who might be listening who are similarly inspired to write in fictional form about a historical event or person?
Well, I think a wonderful, wonderful way to begin, if you can, and it always works for me, it's the charm, is if you're writing about a particular place and it's possible for you to physically visit that place, I think that's a wonderful way to just tap into the, you know, tap into the power of that place. But you may not be able to do that, certainly, especially now, or if you're writing. I was teaching a workshop not long ago where someone was writing something set at a temple in ancient Greece. But I think if you can find a way to begin to put yourself closely in touch with that other place. Now, for me, what I've done with both of these novels and what I'm doing with my current novel in progress, and again, it's not intentional. I don't know how, I know some writers perhaps are very intentional in their choice of topic. For me, topics just grab me and places just grab me. But with The Bull with Gold Seams and Frida's Song, both of those were inspired by places that were very close to places where I actually have lived. And I think, you know, there's a wonderful way in which then you, the writer, feel like you are able to almost, you know, step through that door into that other time or place. I'm currently working again on another book that's inspired by a particular place and a particular family in Western Pennsylvania. And I love the feeling of being familiar with where the story is based. You know, it's like, I mean, I guess it's, you know, where, when, what, you know, where and when there are starting blocks. But then the fun, I think, if you're going to write something, is to give yourself some freedom to jump off from that and say, but I can fill in the blanks about what's happening. I can fill in the blanks about why it's happening. So I like your question about what would I say to other writers. I guess I would say, don't feel that you have to be just solely wedded to fact and history. Because if you want to be wedded to fact and history, you could write biography or you could write history. But if you want to write fiction, let yourself experience a little of the fun and the magic of filling in the blanks of what's happening and why.
Mm-hmm. I like what you say about place being so important, because I can imagine the resonance of standing on the ground, especially if it's something that you have an emotional connection with already, as someplace you were as a child or someplace you were as a young adult, and then thinking about that place in history and how it ties to the present. Ellen,
and it really happens. I went back to Frida's cottage, just the exterior, to film the little video trailer about the book, which is on my website. And the day I was there filming the trailer, I was a little bit early, and I was walking up the very long driveway that used to lead to the Chestnut Lodge Hospital, which is gone now. And it still leads to Frida's little white cottage. So I'm walking up this very long driveway, and zooming down the driveway straight at me are 3 teenage boys on their skateboards. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's my character, Nick. And
there goes Nick. There he goes
for me.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Ellen, can you tell us where we can find Frida's the Frida song, the book?
Absolutely. Frida's song is, as they say, is for sale everywhere the books are sold, but a couple of places locally here in the DC area, you don't need to go to them. You can contact them online. Peerless Rockville, the Historic Society in Rockville, has signed copies of Frida's song. Politics and Prose here in DC has Frida's song. If you go to my website, ellencampbell.net, there's links to buy it other places, indie.org. You can always call your favorite independent bookstore wherever you are and ask them to order it. And it's available too in all of the big online emporiums whose names I don't need to and won't mention.
And it's available at the Cleveland Public Library, I understand.
It's available at the Cleveland Park Public Library, which is the first library I remember going to as a child. It's available at the Montgomery County Public Library. If you want it to be available in your library, wherever you live, ask. I am a huge library fan, and it's so exciting to have that book in the libraries.
Yes, I'm sorry, I said Cleveland Public Library and I meant Cleveland Park Public Library. Let's open up the questions to the listeners, and let's just take a few questions from the listeners, and we hope to get to all of your questions. Let's see. Christina asks, how would you create the character if you don't have a lot of information about them?
Well, that might be the best possible circumstance to be in, because then you can use the little bit of information you have, and then you can begin to do a character building exercise. And there's lots of ways you can do it. You can think about what are some traits you might borrow from someone you know. How might the character be like you or different from you? There's lots of wonderful outlines of ways to think about and build a character. What do they love to do? What do they love to eat? But I think it's not a bad thing not to have a lot of information when you're building a character.
You can let your imagination run wild.
Absolutely.
Linda asks, I understand that Frida's papers at the Library of Congress were to be made available last year, and have you had a chance to look at them? And if
I
so,
have not. It's
have-
very exciting that they have been unsealed. Her papers, many of her papers disappeared soon after her death. Some of her papers were then given to the Library of Congress under a 20-year seal. And so it will be fascinating to see those papers. I haven't been down to the Library of Congress since the pandemic. I loved going down there and did some research there pre-pandemic, but it will be exciting to go down there and see those, read those papers.
That is my favorite place in Washington, is the
Isn't
Library
it
of
wonderful?
Congress.
Aren't we lucky? Oh, we're so incredibly
We
lucky.
are, we really are. Well, it will be interesting. I'll be there and I'll be holding your version of her papers next to her actual papers and comparing, seeing how you did with guessing at what she might have put into her papers. Kristen says the book is also available at sama-art.org. So that's in the chat for anyone.
Oh, Chris, I'm so glad you're here tonight. And I'm so glad you still have copies of the book there. That's great. Thank you.
And
That's
what
in
is the
Bedford
organization?
County.
Pardon?
SAMA is a wonderful art gallery in Bedford, Pennsylvania.
Oh, great. That, and we'll mention that that is where Ellen's previous novel is set. The Bowl with Gold Seams is set in that area. Who owned the cottage that Frida designed? And did she design it?
She did indeed design it. You know, the Chestnut Lodge had big and beautiful grounds, and the owners of the lodge, the Bullards, Dr. Bullard and Ann Bullard, very much wanted Frida to stay. And in order to keep her happy at the lodge, they offered her the opportunity to design her own home there on the lodge grounds. The Bullards owned the grounds, the Bullards owned the lodge, but Frida worked very closely with one of the really good architects in Rockville at that time and designed the cottage. Now, this is an interesting example of the way a novelist's view can diverge from a biographer's view. My Frida, my understanding of Frida is that as a woman who had lost almost everything, the opportunity to design this home and to live in a home she designed was fantastic. And the cottage was something that became a real haven for her, a kind of asylum for her, and that she loved it. And that's very much part of the trajectory of Frida designing the cottage in my novel. I had the wonderful opportunity of hearing her biographer talk, Gail Hornstein, who wrote just a fabulous biography of Frida called To Save One Life. And it was very clear that Dr. Hornstein feels that since Frida lived in so much grander circumstances in Germany, the cottage probably felt like a come down to her. So you see, that's a clear example of, you know, I'll hold to my Frida, and Dr. Hornstein's is deeply informed by fact and history, but sometimes, you know, you just have to go with that fictional truth.
And historians have to do a little bit of interpretation themselves. So we have to keep that in mind. Charlie, I'm not sure, but Charlie says, I'm writing a mystery novel I call genealogical fiction. And Ellen speaks to me in so many ways, especially when she speaks of ghosts and the magical process of how it begins to write itself in a world where spirits transcend time.
It sounds like you're having fun. And I love reading mysteries, you know, and Ginny's upcoming novel is a wonderful mystery.
Good. Get that plug in there, Ellen. Thank you. Can you talk about how you started your writing career and how long it takes you to research and write a novel? That's from Heather.
Oh, Heather, you know, I think I started my writing career when I first learned to read and write, and I was wanting all my life to be a writer. But I took a very long detour, a very, very, very long detour, and I did not come back to writing fiction until I had been working as a psychotherapist for more than 20 years. But when I did start writing again, it was partly as a response to 9/11. It was partly as a response to my parents' deaths, coincidentally around the same time. And those two experiences, I think, in a way, unconsciously reminded me that if I was going to fulfill that childhood dream of writing, it was time to get started. So what I started doing was writing stories early in the morning before I went to work. And the stories grew into collections of stories. And one of the stories grew into my first novel. Another story, when I was in a writer's group with Ginny, became this novel, Frida's Song. But I am not fast, I'm writing quote unquote full-time now, but you can imagine how many times full-time writing means I have to take a break to dust the bookshelves or something. But what is really, really wonderful for me now is to be having a chance to write and fulfill that lifelong dream of mine.
Just for the record, dusting the bookshelves is part of the creative process.
Oh, it definitely is.
You have to think about something else every once in a while, and then you get your ideas.
Swimming is part of the creative process. Ginny and I used to encounter each other going in and out of the Rockville swimming pool, and I've missed it since moving to DC and the pandemic.
Yeah. Now, Margie and Betty both ask about Chestnut Lodge being the subject or the setting of the book, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Is that apocryphal? Is that true? And if so, did it influence you?
It is absolutely true. Chestnut Lodge is indeed the setting for I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And I read I Never Promised You a Rose Garden in junior high, and it had a powerful impact on me, as I think it does on many people who read it. The fictional psychiatrist in I Never Promised You a Rose Garden is indeed Frida Fromm-Reichmann.
Oh, wow.
Frida Fromm-Reichmann was the psychiatrist for Joanne Greenberg. Joanne Greenberg, the author of I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Now, a funny story about me and I Never Promised You a Rose Garden and Chestnut Lodge. When I'm writing, it's very rare for me to seek to interview someone who might have personal experience of the time or place I'm writing about. And I think it's partly because as a psychotherapist for so many years, I was so attuned to the principle of keeping what individuals told me confidential, that it would be very hard for me, even though I'm writing now, making things up, it would be very hard for me to interview someone and then use what they told me in my fiction without feeling I was violating a boundary. My brother, who's a documentary film producer, can't believe I'm this squeamish about it. And every now and again, I know that I've missed wonderful little bits of something that if I had talked to someone, I would have had access to. I'm not willing to give up my way of working, but when Frida's Song was published, an old friend of my mom's and mine said, "Ellen, did you know who my college roommate was?" And I said, no, who was your college roommate? And she said, Joanne Greenberg. Now, when Joanne Greenberg had successfully concluded her treatment with Frida, she did go to college here in Washington, D.C. And so it's fascinating to think that all these years I've known someone who had a very close personal relationship with her. Joanne Greenberg does not figure in the novel, but certainly the novel includes Frida working with a patient, a girl, who is certainly intended to be the girl that later on would go on to write I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. So it's sort of like a book within a book within a book.
Oh, wow. That is really fascinating to know, because she really, really wanted to heal that person that she was working with.
She really did want to heal that person.
Yeah. Oh, so that's a nice connection. Ellen, do you have a short snippet that you can read from the book for us?
I'd love to read something. I'll read to you a little bit in Frida's voice. And all you need to know if you haven't read the book is that Frida lives in her cottage by now. It's November 1938. Her dear friend Gertrude is living with her, and it's breakfast time. I come downstairs, enjoying the smell of eggs and toast and coffee. Muni leads me to the front door, eager to play fetch with the paper. He gums it up in his soft spaniel mouth and brings it to Gertrude. She rewards him with a bite of toast. I open the paper. Nietzsche says, "The man who does not lose his mind over certain things has no mind to lose." Gertrude, my hands tremble. I must tell her. I cannot protect her. A young German Jew exiled in Paris has killed a German official. All through Germany and Austria, they are wreaking havoc on Jewish businesses, smashing windows, stealing and burning merchandise, burning synagogues and schools. A surgeon I know in Munich arrested for the crime of being Jewish. We hold each other. The phone rings. I do not answer. Morning light glints on the silver coffee pot I purchased, filling out my life again with domestic objects, deluded into believing in the security of belongings. The thick raspberry jam shines like a dark jewel, like clotted blood in the crystal dish. Crystal. Crystal knocked, the paper calls it. The night of shattered glass. And that's where I'll stop, but that's a little snippet from Frida's imagined diary.
Thank you so much for that reading. Someone lives in Frida's cottage now, do they not? And that's their home.
Yes, yes.
Because it's become a development, a housing development.
Well, you know, the cottage is one of the few buildings that remains from the original lodge. There are a couple of other residences that were lodge dwellings, and there's a big old house that the Bullards lived in that still exists. The cottage still exists, this little cottage, and it is surrounded mostly by mini mansions now that were built on the property. And, you know, Peerless Rockville restored the cottage, and someone rents the cottage from Peerless. And it was for rent about a year ago. It was for rent again. And my husband said, "So Ellen, Frida's cottage is for rent." And I said, "Boy, you know, that would be some writing studio."
I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe Ginny,
in your future.
we could each have a little study.
Well, Ellen, thank you so much for this evening. It has been such a fun talk, and I've learned a lot. And I think everyone on the chat has expressed their appreciation to you. And the very last comment is, "You are inspirational." So that's something to end on. I'm going to toss.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. It's been fun talking with you, Ginny, and I can't wait till Marsh Queen is out.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm going to toss this back to Linda Ayers now, who is going to tell you what's next in the Tuesday Night Talks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen and Ginny. It's always terrific to hear two novelists who are also friends talking about writing. That just can't be beat. Thanks so much for being here and participating. I'd also like to thank Frank Fittemore, the Executive Director of the Cleveland and Woodley Park Village, for making the technology go smoothly tonight. And thanks to our audience. You've been wonderful with your questions and comments. I hope you'll come back on February 15th, when Tamara Belt from Tregaron Conservancy and Erin Gleason, beekeeper and naturalist, will talk about DC's nature and ecology. Until then, stay warm, stay well, and thank you so much. Good night.